All right, so let me get started. First off, none of this work would exist without the phenomenal students in my lab, in particular, two of the students that are here today. A lot of the work I'm going to go through focuses on the work of their PhDs, so thank you very much to Will and Sang-Wook. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a lot of really complex machine learning. So I assume everyone in here has taken at least like 10 courses on deep learning and everyone's ready to go. Yeah, maybe not. Okay, I'm kidding, of course. This is really as complex as we'll get. So deep learning will be a black box for most of this talk, and that's okay. That's not the part we need to understand. All we really need to understand is that a single modal learning, so how we think of most machine learning kind of prior to the last few years, is really you have, for example, an input image here, like an X-ray. It goes into that deep learning black box, and out of it comes a vector of numbers. So these could be 5 different numbers representing the probability of 5 different diseases for the patient. So very simple. Now, when we go to multimodal, what we then think of is now, instead of taking a single modality of data in, like an X-ray, we can then input multiple modalities, so text, for example. And so you have probably seen ChatGPT by this point, unless maybe you are living under a rock. And so if you've seen ChatGPT, then what you may have also noticed now is you can put images into ChatGPT, and you couldn't do that when it first came out. Although that seems like a long time ago, it was really only about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, but you really originally couldn't put an image. So how does putting in an image work? Well, basically you can stick the X-ray into the little box, and then you can put in a paragraph below it, like for example, what is an X-ray? And ChatGPT will spit out a, in this case, mostly meaningless response that doesn't actually matter. But it'll basically say, hey, this is a chest X-ray, not a penguin. Okay, so that's a few $1 billion well spent. But this is the kind of the beginnings of what multimodal means. So how does that actually work? So this is kind of the main idea to how it works. So we're going to stick with these black boxes for AI, and that's okay for now. So we have an image encoder like before, so a deep learning algorithm on the far left that takes as input the image. We have a large language model, so that's something like ChatGPT. And in the middle, we're just going to train what you can think of as a translator. So it's going to take those 5 output numbers from the vision encoder and translate them into numbers that the language model can understand. So it's just kind of like a translation, like from English to French or vice versa. And so that little Q-former in the middle is then trained to take the representation from the image, translate it to the language model, and then the language model is now able to take, in this case, a picture of a romantic sunset and write a little poem that goes along with it. Okay, so then that works really good for 2 modalities. But in medicine, we often don't have 2 modalities or 3 modalities. Maybe we have more than that. And so how do we bind multiple modalities together? That was the kind of thing that we started off working on last summer. And so in this image here, we have a chest X-ray, an ECG, and text. And each one can go through its own separate encoder. So when they do, each one becomes its own separate vector, in this case of 5 different numbers. And then what we can do is we can actually bind them all together in order to create one shared representation. So before, that idea was we needed to learn that translator to go from kind of what a vision encoder thought of an image to what a language model could understand. Now what we want to do is a little bit different. And we're going to go, well, for this patient, we have an X-ray, and we have an ECG, and we have a set of clinical reports. And now I want to see if there's a set of those transforming kind of little models that can translate them all to a shared space. Very similar to the UMAPs and the PCAs and things we were just looking at in the last talk. So can I get it such that if I were to show a model your X-ray, and if I were to show a different model your ECG, and a different model your report, all of them would actually look like the same set of numbers. So the model would understand that it's your X-ray, and it's your ECG, and it's your report, that they were all paired together as opposed to being random things just off in space. And if you want to see the paper, there's a QR code, and you can go through there. So we ran this for our first problem, and our first problem was doing hospital readmittance, 30-day readmission, and in-hospital mortality. And so there's been a few papers on this subject over the years, one included published in Nature, and so that's kind of our baseline that we're going to compare to. And that's what we call this text-only model. So the text-only model only takes language as input. So you may have heard of models like BioBERT or ChatGPT, of course. And as input, then they take those reports from the x-rays that, now we wrote these, so they're very simple, but actual medical reports, of course, not simple sentences, reports from the ECGs, and then they try to summarize the probability of a patient having either a 30-day readmit or a in-hospital mortality. Oh, sorry, I need to go back. And there we go. And so the actual probabilities, or the accuracies for those is reasonable, about 75% for in-hospital mortality. And then we switch to our model, which instead works with now the modalities. So we've replaced the actual human reports, so that report from the x-ray and the report from the ECG are now gone, and we've replaced them with the x-ray models and the ECG models separately, feeding into that same type of language model, and we hit the same accuracy. So that may sound like a failure, but remember, we weren't actually really trying to beat it, we were really trying to tie it, because we took out having to read the x-ray and read the ECG, and are then able to predict with the same level of accuracy whether or not that patient had a 30-day readmit or a in-hospital mortality. So that's one thing you can do with these multimodal models, is you can try to understand multiple modalities at the same time and predict some downstream event. So, okay, now I'm going to go over something that you'll kind of see in a lot of machine learning papers coming out more and more often, and it's called zero and few shot, which sounds super complicated, but they're actually not so bad. So zero and few shot are basically you have an x-ray, like at the top there, and you input it into both models. So you input the x-ray into your into your x-ray encoder, and you're going to point. And so that little gray point just showed up. So that's from this checked x-ray is normal. And then I can also input the text from the orange blob into the model, and I'm going to get the orange point. So each of those paragraphs of text, a description of what a normal patient looks like, and a description of what a sick patient looks like, go into a point in space. And remember, my whole thing at the start was that an x-ray should go into the same point in space as its corresponding paragraph. So now I can put my x-ray in, and if it's an x-ray for a sick patient, it should end up closer to the orange dot. And if it's for a healthy patient, it should end up closer to the gray dot. And so that's called zero-shot learning. On the right-hand side, few shot is really just, instead of now having 0 examples, the model has never actually seen pneumonia. Sorry, I don't know why it's auto-advancing on me. Instead of having 0, we can actually now give it a few examples. So few just really means now there's some training, 0 means there's 0 training. And we look, so this is kind of how we can use these large, massive models to train with far fewer samples than we would otherwise have had to. So instead of, if any of you have ever gone to a machine learning person before and said, I want to do machine learning for my study, and they've said, well, do you have 5,000 patients? And you've said no. And they said, well, call me when you do. And you went, okay. Well, this is how we defeat that, because few means like 5 or 10 or 50. So it's starting to get down to more rare diseases or more reasonable aspects of science where we don't have these huge, huge populations. Okay. And so cross-modal now is what I think is kind of the coolest other thing that we can do when we start binding all these modalities together. And so here we did something from a machine learning side, I know, totally crazy, but we went and we took a whole bunch of x-rays for which we had ECG labels and ECGs for which we had x-ray labels, and we tried to do zero-shot learning from the x-rays to the ECG labels and from the ECGs to the x-ray labels. I know. So what the model was actually able to do was diagnose hypertrophy from an x-ray instead of the ECG. The ECG was used for the ground truth, but the model only ever saw the x-ray with no training to do it because it is zero-shot. It's only ever seen ECGs of patients with hypertrophy, never an x-ray. And similarly, for the bottom chunk, it was diagnosing cardiomyopathy from a ECG. And it was able to hit 82% and 84% respectively between the two tasks, on a modality it's never seen for a task that's never been performed before. So finally, please reach out. We would love to collaborate. In general, for existing modalities, we need about 200 patients, 50 events. If you want a brand new modality, then sorry, I actually do still need thousands. Thank you very much.